Beneath the endless sweep of golden desert, there is a silence so complete that it seems to press gently on the skin. It is the kind of silence that swallows even the sound of your own breathing. An ancient stillness, heavy with secrets. The wind moves slowly here, curling around low dunes, carrying with it the faint scent of dust, warmed by the sun. In the daytime, the desert feels alive with light, an ocean of shifting gold that dazzles the eyes. But when the sun dips low and the shadows lengthen, that golden sea becomes a place of shadows and whispers. It is in these hours, when the day exhales into night, that the land seems to remember. Long before history was written in books, it was etched into stone, clay, and memory. And long before even that, it was carried in the voices of storytellers, their words curling upward into starlit skies. Here in this place, those voices speak still, though you must listen very closely. They speak of a resting place, hidden beneath the sands, sealed before the pyramids were built, and kept untouched for 40 centuries. Imagine it, a tomb sealed so completely that not a single grain of its treasure has been disturbed by human hands since the day its builders walked away. Not a single step echoed in its halls, not a single flame flickered against its walls in all the long ages since the stones themselves have kept watch, their weight pressing down through windstorms and rainless years, while empires rose and crumbled above. This is no ordinary burial place. It was more than a monument, more than a tomb. It was a promise that the dead would rest undisturbed, and that what was placed with them would remain as it was forever. A promise that was guarded not only by the weight of stone, but by something far less tangible, belief. In the desert, belief is a kind of architecture. It shapes the way people move, the way they speak, the way they dare, or do not dare, to act. Here it was belief that made the people tell stories of a guardian who never left, a sentinel of flesh or spirit, whose watch would not falter. Belief that made them carve warnings into stone, warnings meant to pierce the hearts of the living as much as to honor the dead. You can almost hear the breath of those who sealed it, their hearts pounding with the knowledge that they were laying their leader, their protector, their God-king, into the earth. The desert was different then, perhaps greener, with rivers or palm groves not far away. But even then, it was a place of endings, where the horizon swallowed all things eventually. And here they stood on that last day, as the final stones slid into place, shutting out the world of the living. We do not know their names. We do not know if they thought of themselves as builders, mourners, or conspirators, but we can be certain of this: they felt the weight of what they were doing. Some may have believed that the one they buried would wake again, needing every treasure, every vessel of food and water, every symbol of power they had placed at his side. Others may have believed in the curse whispered in the marketplace, that any hand daring to break the seal would be struck down, and so they left him there. They left him, and they left the silence. Over time, the world forgot the path to the tomb. The sands shifted, covering what little might have been visible. Perhaps an old stone marker lay half buried for a few generations, a reminder to those who passed nearby, until even it disappeared beneath the dunes. Above the tomb, centuries turned to millennia. The world changed, kingdoms clashed, languages were born and died. The people who had built the tomb became shadows in the historical record, their faces lost to time, their voices fading into the wind. But underground, nothing changed. The air inside was as still as the day it was sealed. Clay jars sat unbroken, gold lay untarnished, the bones of a ruler slept in perfect darkness. It is here, in this tension between what is hidden and what is known, that our journey begins. We will move back and forth between two worlds, the one above the sand, noisy and ever-changing, and the one below, still and untouched. We will ask questions that may never be fully answered. Who was laid here, and why was he guarded so fiercely? Was it love, loyalty, or fear that kept the living away for 4,000 years? And what happens in the end, when the seal is broken? The story you are about to hear is both history and mystery, fact and speculation, the light of discovery and the shadow of uncertainty. It is the story of a tomb, but also the story of the people who built it, the people who protected it, and the people who would one day dare to open it. And so we begin with the sand, quiet now, but restless in its own way, drifting in slow waves over the secret it has kept for so long. The tomb had waited for 4,000 years, but the moment of its rediscovery did not come in a grand cinematic sweep. It arrived quietly, almost humbly, on a morning when the desert's heat had not yet risen. The archaeologists had been working in the region for months. The sight, to most eyes, seemed unremarkable. A low stretch of wind-swept earth, half swallowed by drifts of sand. Their initial surveys had been met with skepticism. Nothing in the visible landscape hinted at the enormity of what lay beneath. But history often hides in plain sight, and the team believed the ground might be holding something extraordinary. It began with a faint change in the soil. When sand is disturbed, it tells a story to those who know how to read it. In one small area, the grains were packed differently, the color subtly darker. The senior archaeologist, a man whose career had been defined by patience, stopped the team and had them mark the spot. Every excavation is a race, not against other researchers, but against time itself. The moment the earth is opened, the clock begins ticking. Air, light, and human touch begin to change what has been perfectly preserved for centuries. And in the desert, there is the added urgency of shifting weather. One hard wind can erase days of careful digging. So they worked with deliberate precision. Metal trowels scraped gently at the surface, revealing the faint outline of what seemed to be a buried wall. It was not a wall in the architectural sense, more like the edge of a long-forgotten foundation. The sand clung stubbornly, as though reluctant to give up its charge. By mid-morning, the sun was high enough to turn the air to glass. The team paused often, sipping water under a canvas shade, but their eyes kept returning to the dig site, to the pale, flat stone, now revealed at the center. It was larger than expected, a single slab fitted so precisely that no tool could slip between its edges. Someone whispered the word door. It was not the right term, perhaps this was no hinged entrance, but the word lingered in the air. A door implied a threshold, and a threshold implied something on the other side. They called in a specialist in ancient masonry. His fingers traced the faint chisel marks along the slab's border. This wasn't a random placement, he murmured. This was sealed, sealed. The word was like a stone dropped into water. It rippled through the group, carrying both excitement and caution. If this slab was truly part of an undisturbed chamber, then everything within might still be as it had been the day it was closed. But that also meant there were rules to follow, legal, ethical, and professional protocols that could not be rushed. Over the next few days, they expanded the excavation around the slab, exposing a shallow corridor leading toward it. The corridor was narrow, its walls made from the same stone as the slab, as though the builders had carved the approach with deliberate intent. Faint carvings began to emerge along the sides, not clear enough to read, but enough to suggest this was not merely functional architecture. The heat made each step heavier, but there was a current of energy running through the camp now. The slab was no longer just an object, it was a threshold to something ancient and untouched. Each new inch of exposed surface revealed more of the craftsmanship, tight joins, smooth planes, and a faint reddish pigment that hinted at ceremonial painting long since faded. One evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, the archaeologists gathered at the edge of the trench. They stood in the half-light, the air cooling at last, and looked down at the slab. The wind swept across the desert, low and soft, as though it too was watching. It was in this moment that the scale of the find began to settle on them. If their calculations were correct, the style of construction matched a period older than much of the region's recorded history. Older than the great dynasties, whose ruins still drew tourists from across the globe. Older perhaps than the earliest written records of the nearby kingdoms. In the days that followed, the team began the slow process of documenting every inch of the site. High-resolution photographs were taken, soil samples were catalogued, every stone fragment was mapped and logged. Patience is the archaeologist's most necessary tool, but here, patience took on a new kind of weight. They knew that once the slab was moved, the contents would be exposed to air for the first time in millennia, and once that happened, preservation would be as much a challenge as discovery. Yet, even with this caution, there was a subtle tension growing in the camp. The workers spoke less, the night seemed darker, the wind at times made sounds that reminded them of distant voices. No one said the word curse aloud, but it drifted at the edges of conversation, the way superstition always does when the past stirs too vividly. The slab ceiling was unlike anything they had seen before, no mortar, no visible binding agent, yet the stone had held perfectly in place for thousands of years. When they finally inserted a probe to measure the air quality beyond, the readings came back with astonishing results. The chamber beyond was not only sealed, but almost hermetically preserved. The oxygen levels were low, the humidity nearly non-existent, conditions that could keep organic materials intact, far beyond normal expectations. In the early hours of the final preparatory day, the lead archaeologist stood alone at the site. The desert was still, the stars overhead sharp and unblinking. He placed his palm against the slab. The stone was cool to the touch, its surface slightly rough, as if worn by unseen hands long ago. In that moment, he felt not like a conqueror of history, but a guest, one who had been invited into a place that had no reason to welcome him. The opening was scheduled for the following morning. Teams from museums, preservation labs, and the local antiquities authority would be present. It would be a day of careful work, of measured progress, and of the first sight, in 4,000 years, of what lay beyond the slab. The night before, the camp was quiet. No music played, no voices carried. Even the desert seemed to still itself, as though waiting. Somewhere beneath their feet, in a darkness older than any living memory, the tomb waited too. To understand the tomb, you must first understand the world that made it a world now gone, not only in ruins and dust, but in memory itself. Even the name of the kingdom is lost to us. What remains is a scattering of fragments, weathered inscriptions, shards of pottery, tools buried in forgotten layers of earth. Yet from these fragments, like a painter coaxing a portrait from faint strokes, we can imagine the people who lived here 4,000 years ago. It was a time before the great empires that dominate our textbooks had reached their height. Egypt's mighty pyramids stood far to the west, and Mesopotamia's ziggurats rose in the east. But here, between river and desert, a smaller kingdom thrived. Its people were traders, artisans, farmers, and soldiers. They built not to be remembered for eternity, but to serve the needs of the present, and yet paradoxically, it is one of their creations that has outlasted them all. The land was not the endless, waterless desert we see today. Seasonal rivers ran through shallow valleys, feeding groves of date palms and patches of cultivated grain. Villages dotted the banks, their mud brick houses low and square, each with a small hearth that smoked gently in the morning air. Children chased each other between the fields, while elders gathered in the shade to tell stories of the gods. We know from surviving artifacts that their craftsmanship was exceptional. Bronze tools with sharp, even edges, pottery so thin it was almost translucent, necklaces of carnelian and lapis lazuli, stones carried from lands hundreds of miles away. This was a people who valued beauty as much as function, and who could weave the two seamlessly into everyday life. Their rulers lived apart in compounds surrounded by high walls, not palaces in the later sense. There were no towering columns or grand courtyards, but fortresses of power nonetheless. Within these walls, decisions were made about trade, war, and tribute. Here scribes kept careful tallies of grain and cattle, recording them on clay tablets that baked hard in the sun. The dynasty that ruled this kingdom may have been short-lived by the standards of history, perhaps only a few centuries, but its leaders understood the importance of permanence in death. For them, the tomb was not simply a place to lay a body, it was the final statement of their reign, a stone echo that would outlast their voice. This is the world into which the man in the tomb was born. We cannot know his name, but the scale and skill of his burial suggest he was a ruler, or perhaps a figure of even greater significance. He would have grown up in the heart of the walled compound, his earliest memories filled with the smell of incense from temple rites and the distant sound of soldiers drilling in the yard. His people believed in a layered universe, the realm of the living, the realm of the dead, and a higher invisible realm where the gods dwelled. Life was seen as a preparation for the journey beyond, and the king's role was not only to lead in life, but to secure safe passage for his people in the afterlife. Festivals marked the cycles of planting and harvest, each one woven with prayers for balance between these realms. When this ruler walked among his subjects, he would have been both a familiar figure and a distant one, visible yet set apart by ceremony and tradition. His robes would have been dyed in rare colors, his jewelry heavy with meaning as much as metal. Every gesture in public was calculated to project stability, prosperity, and divine favor. The tomb that now lay beneath the desert began as an idea, perhaps even while the ruler was still young. Plans would have been drawn in the dust, discussed in quiet council with architects and priests. The site, chosen with care, aligned with the stars or the rising of the sun at a certain time of year. Workers, artisans, and laborers would have been summoned, some traveling from distant settlements, to take part in the king's final project. In this age, to build a tomb was to weave together stone, ritual, and myth. It was not enough for it to be secure, it had to embody the beliefs of the people. Walls were carved with protective symbols, offerings of food and drink were sealed inside clay jars, their contents meant to nourish the ruler's spirit in the journey to the next world. Weapons were placed beside him, not for use in the mortal realm, but to defend against whatever dangers lay in the unseen one. Even as the tomb took shape, life above it continued in rhythm. Children grew, seasons shifted, caravans came and went, carrying spices, metals, and stories from far-off lands. And yet, the slow, steady work of the burial chamber remained constant, as though it moved according to its own sacred clock. When at last the ruler died, whether in peace or in sudden tragedy, we do not know, the entire kingdom would have entered a period of mourning. Songs were sung in his honor, incense burned in every temple, priests recited the names of his ancestors, calling on them to guide him safely into the realm of the dead. The funeral procession must have been a sight of profound solemnity. The body, wrapped in fine cloth, was carried along the path to the tomb, accompanied by musicians playing slow, haunting melodies. At the entrance, the priests performed final rites, sealing charms into the doorway and invoking the guardian spirit that would stand eternal watch. Once the king was placed within, surrounded by treasures and symbols of his reign, the stone slab was lowered into position. The sound of it settling, a deep resonant thud, would have echoed in the chamber like the closing of a book. The workers filed out in silence, the final seals were set. The sand, patient and impartial, began its slow work of covering the tomb once more. For generations afterward, the tomb was remembered. Parents told their children of the great ruler who slept beneath the sands. Travelers were warned to pass at a distance, lest they disturb his rest. But as time passed, the stories grew dimmer, the exact location forgotten. The dynasty fell, its enemies conquered the land, and new rulers rose, each leaving their own marks upon history, until the old kingdom's memory dissolved into legend. Yet still, deep below the tomb remained, the last intact testament to a world that otherwise vanished, and it is to that world, in its moment of endings and beginnings, that we now turn. Because the next step in our story is not about its ruler in life, but the guardian who remained in death. Long before archaeologists brushed away the first grains of sand from the tomb's entrance, there were stories. They were told in low voices, often by the elders, and almost always at night. Stories of a man who never died, a sentinel who kept his post for 4,000 years. Some said he was a warrior in life, the ruler's most loyal captain. Others claimed he was the ruler's brother, bound by blood and oath to protect him, even beyond death. There were even whispers that he had not been human at all, but a spirit in the shape of a man, a being the priests summoned during the burial rites to guard the tomb until the end of days. Whatever the version, the core of the tale was the same: the guardian could not be bribed, could not be deceived, and could not be defeated. Any who approached the tomb with greed in their heart would meet him, and none who did were seen again. In the villages nearest the desert edge, children grew up with warnings disguised as bedtime tales. If you wander too far into the dunes, their mothers would say, "The guard will find you, his shadow will fall over you, and when you look up, it will already be too late." The words were said half in jest, but the glances exchanged between the adults were serious. Travelers passing through the region would sometimes hear the locals mention the one who stands, never by a personal name, as if to name him was to invite his attention. Around campfires, a few would speak of footprints that appeared in the sand where no man had walked for days. Others spoke of hearing a single deliberate footstep behind them, only to turn and find the empty desert. From a historian's perspective, such tales are easy to dismiss. Folk memory can preserve kernels of truth, but over centuries, details bend and stretch like shadows at dusk. And yet, every legend begins somewhere. When researchers finally began to study the site in the early 20th century, they were surprised to find references to a keeper of the door carved into stone fragments near the area. The language was ancient, the symbols spare and severe. In one fragment, the guardian was depicted as a towering figure holding a long spear in one hand and a ring-shaped object in the other, perhaps a key, perhaps a symbol of eternal watch. But there was something unsettling about these carvings. Unlike typical depictions of soldiers or servants in tomb art, this figure was never shown in profile, never in motion. Always he faced forward, eyes fixed on the viewer. One archaeologist, in his personal journal, wrote, "It is as though the artist intended to capture not the likeness of a man, but the sensation of being watched. I have studied hundreds of burial reliefs. None have unnerved me quite like these." The deeper the excavation went, the more signs of this guardian appeared, small amulets with his image hidden in niches along the approach to the tomb, a faded mural showing him standing at a stone doorway while shadowy forms cowered behind him. Even the layout of the passageways seemed designed to slow and disorient intruders, as though funneling them toward an inevitable encounter. And then there were the footprints. One of the earliest teams reported finding a line of shallow impressions in the sand near the entrance, not recent, but somehow distinct, as if pressed there long ago and preserved by an odd quirk of wind and terrain. They matched no animal known in the region, and their spacing was inconsistent with natural erosion. The team took photographs, but when the film was developed, the images were oddly blurred, as if the shape resisted being captured. Skeptics have offered explanations: tricks of light, the mind's tendency to see patterns, the locals deliberately planting evidence to protect the site from looters. But such explanations never fully erased the unease the stories caused. The legend of the guard persisted because it resonated with something deeper than simple superstition. Perhaps it was the idea that loyalty could survive even death, that a promise made in life could bind a soul for eternity. Or perhaps it was the warning woven into the myth: some places are not meant to be disturbed. It's easy to see why the ancient kingdom might have encouraged such a legend. Tombs, especially of rulers, were targets for thieves even in antiquity. A story of an undying sentinel would serve as an effective deterrent, as potent as any physical trap. And if the ruler's subjects truly believed the guardian was real, their fear would keep the tomb untouched long after the dynasty itself vanished. But there is an uncomfortable wrinkle to this explanation. The stories of the guard did not fade as centuries passed, they sharpened. Accounts from different eras, separated by hundreds of years, speak of nearly identical encounters, a lone figure, motionless at first, then stepping forward with deliberate, unhurried pace, the air growing unnaturally still, the sudden primal certainty that escape was impossible. Whether the tomb's builders crafted this legend as a protective ruse, or whether it grew from something far stranger, is impossible to say. What is certain is that when the first modern attempts to open the tomb began, the warnings came back to life, and they came from people who had nothing to gain by repeating them. Several members of the excavations supply team, locals hired to bring water and tools from nearby settlements, refused to work after a certain day. They claimed they had seen a figure standing on the ridge above the site at dawn. At first, they thought it was a soldier from the archaeological party. But as they drew closer, they noticed the figure's clothing was wrong, a robe of pale, almost colorless fabric, and in his hand, something long and thin that caught the morning light. When they looked again, the figure was gone, not moved, gone. The team's leader, eager to keep work on schedule, dismissed it as nerves. But that evening, one of the archaeologists privately admitted that he had also seen a man watching from a distance earlier in the week, and that he had felt as though the man was not simply looking but measuring him. These early sightings marked the shift from legend to lived experience for the dig team. The guardian of the tomb was no longer just a figure carved in ancient stone. He had stepped, at least in their minds, into the present. And with that the first unease began to settle over the camp, the kind that is not loud or dramatic but quiet and persistent, like a low hum you only notice when the world around you falls still. They had been warned, they had heard the stories, and yet they were about to go deeper than anyone had gone in thousands of years. By the time the excavation reached its second month, the desert had begun to show signs that the team could no longer ignore. It started subtly, the kind of small, inconvenient disturbances that can be brushed aside when there is a deadline to meet and history to uncover. But as the days passed, the patterns became harder to dismiss. The first warning came with the wind. A storm rolled in from the south. Not particularly fierce by desert standards, but carrying an odd quality. It seemed to swirl only around the site itself, circling in slow, deliberate spirals. The tents rattled, tools clinked against one another, and sand drifted into the passageway, leading to the tomb's entrance, filling it as though trying to seal it again. When the storm passed, the archaeologists set about clearing the sand from the stone steps they had uncovered the previous week. It was then that one of the junior researchers noticed something strange. Near the base of the steps, the sand had settled in neat, straight ridges, unnatural in their precision, like lines drawn by a careful hand. There were 5 in total, evenly spaced, each about the length of a forearm. They did not match the wind's usual patterns, nor the marks left by tools or human feet. One of the local workers, seeing the lines, went pale. He muttered something in his own tongue and backed away, refusing to continue that day's work. When pressed, he simply said, "It is writing," and would say no more. The lines were swept away, the steps cleared, and the work pressed on. But the next morning, more marks appeared, this time closer to the mouth of the passage. This time, they looked less like straight lines and more like crude symbols, their curves slightly raised as if pushed up from beneath the sand rather than pressed down from above. A few of the team members joked that the desert itself was trying to speak, but their laughter sounded thin in the still air. The second warning was less subtle. One afternoon, a section of scaffolding near the entrance collapsed without warning. No one was hurt, but when the wreckage was examined, they found that several of the wooden supports had been cleanly split, not by weight, but as if cut with a sharp blade. Yet, there were no signs of tools, no footprints in the soft sand around the fallen beams. That evening, as the workers gathered for their meal, one of the older men from the nearest village arrived at camp. He had heard of the collapse, and he brought with him a small clay jar. Inside was a dark, coarse powder. Through a translator, he explained that it was to be scattered around the camp each night, a barrier against what walks. The archaeologists politely declined, but the man left the jar behind anyway, placing it at the edge of the firelight before disappearing into the night. The third warning came with sound. In the early hours before dawn, several team members awoke to the distant rhythm of footsteps. At first they thought it was one of the night guards making rounds, but when they stepped outside their tents, the sound was coming not from the camp, but from the direction of the tomb. Slow, measured steps that crunched in the sand, paused, and then continued. The footsteps never came closer, nor did they retreat. They simply circled unseen until the first light of morning. The lead archaeologist, committed to keeping the dig on schedule, tried to rationalize each event. The wind patterns were coincidence. The collapsed scaffolding was a fault in the wood. The footsteps were the product of sleeplessness and the desert's tendency to play tricks on the senses, but the local workers, whose parents and grandparents had grown up in the shadow of these dunes, began to leave. Some slipped away without a word, their tents empty by morning. Others offered quiet apologies, explaining that they had families to protect. Their absence slowed progress, forcing the archaeologists to do more of the clearing and cataloguing themselves. But in private, several admitted that the empty spaces in camp made the nights feel colder, the wind sharper. As the days passed, the warnings grew bolder. One morning, the team found the passage to the tomb blocked entirely by a heap of sand and stone that had not been there the night before. It was not the work of wind. The pile was compact, layered and heavy, as though deliberately arranged. Among the stones, they found shards of pottery, some bearing faint etchings of a tall figure holding a spear. The style matched the earlier carvings of the Guardian. Later that week, while documenting artifacts in the outer chamber, a researcher set down her notebook on a flat slab of stone. When she reached for it moments later, the pages were gone, and in their place, a scattering of fine pale sand that smelled faintly of something metallic. By now, the camp was split between those who wanted to push forward and those who believed they had been given every opportunity to turn back. Even the most skeptical among them could not ignore the pattern. Every time they breached a new layer of the tomb, the warnings intensified, as though some invisible boundary was being crossed. And yet, there is a stubbornness that comes with chasing history. When you have devoted years to the search for a site like this, turning back feels like failure, like letting the past keep its secrets simply because it growled in your direction. Still, as one researcher later admitted in a letter to a friend, the real fear was not in the warnings themselves, but in the growing sense that they were not random, that whatever or whoever was behind them was not simply trying to scare the intruders, but measuring them, testing how far they were willing to go. It is easy, in the bright clarity of day, to speak of logic and reason, but when night falls in the desert and the stars hang like cold lanterns above an ocean of shifting dunes, it is much harder to ignore the feeling that something vast and ancient is aware of you, watching, waiting. The archaeologists told themselves they were imagining it, but the desert has its own way of speaking, and its warnings are never given lightly. The next breach into the tomb would prove that some warnings are not meant to be ignored. The day they broke through began with silence. Not the usual hush of the desert, the slow wind, the distant hiss of shifting sand, but a silence so complete that even the most casual conversation seemed to dissolve into it. The local workers who remained stood further back than usual, their eyes fixed on the low, shadowed passage where the team's tools waited. The archaeologists had cleared the last of the blockage from the previous week, revealing the faint curve of a sealed doorway. Its stone was different from the surrounding walls, smoother, darker, flecked with small veins of quartz that caught the light in pale flashes. It was a deliberate construction, built to last. Carved into the center of the doorway was a single image, a figure standing between two tall spears, arms crossed over its chest. Its head was slightly bowed, but the eyes, though only grooves in the stone, seemed to watch the approaching team with an expression that was not quite welcome and not quite warning, something colder. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Holden, approached with a lantern in one hand, his other tracing the lines of the carving. The stone was warm to the touch, though the air inside the passage was cool. He noted it in his logbook, but said nothing else. The breach would be made with care. No dynamite, no heavy machinery. Instead they used small chisels and wooden wedges, tapping gently at the seams where the doorway met the surrounding stone. Each strike echoed strangely in the passage, the sound ringing longer than it should have, as though the tomb itself were hollowing the noise into something deeper. After hours of steady work, a thin line appeared along the right edge of the doorway, not a crack, but a seam. Dr. Holden paused the work to brush away the dust. Beneath it lay a narrow strip of pitch, still pliable after thousands of years, sealing the gap with perfect precision. "This isn't just a door," one of the younger archaeologists whispered. "It's a lock." The others exchanged glances. Locks were rare in structures of this age, especially ones so well preserved. It meant whoever had built this had not merely wanted to protect what was inside, they had wanted to keep it in. The wedges were pressed in further, the chisels tapped more firmly. The seam widened until they could see the faintest sliver of blackness beyond, so deep it seemed almost to pull the lamplight into itself. When the final wedge was driven home, the doorway shifted with a low, grinding sigh. The sound was unlike stone on stone. It was softer, almost organic, as though something living had exhaled. A smell rolled out into the passage. It was not the dry, stale scent of old air, but something damp and metallic, with an undertone that no one could name. It clung to the inside of the nose, and some of the team instinctively stepped back. Dr. Holden was the first to peer inside. At first there was nothing, just darkness. Not the absence of light, but a presence of it, thick and absolute. He held the lantern higher, and the beam fell on a small patch of stone floor just inside, smooth and unmarked. They widened the opening enough to crawl through. The first inside was a junior archaeologist named Carter, who had been with Holden on previous digs. He moved slowly, sweeping his lantern in arcs. The chamber was small, no more than 10 paces across. Its walls lined with shallow niches, each holding a clay jar sealed with a thick, waxy resin. There was no dust, no cobwebs. It was as if the room had been sealed yesterday. The others followed, their footsteps unnaturally loud against the stone. The air inside was heavier than outside, cool but not fresh, carrying that same metallic scent. Along the far wall stood another doorway, this one unsealed, but blocked by a lattice of carved stone bars. Through the narrow gaps, they could see only darkness beyond. The jars in the niches became the first objects catalogued. Each was unmarked, but faint traces of pigment suggested they had once been painted, red, black, and gold. Their contents were unknown, but when one was lifted it felt unexpectedly heavy, as if filled with something denser than sand or grain. Carter suggested opening one for analysis, but Holden refused. "The jars can wait," he said. "There's a reason they were placed here in this chamber, and not deeper inside." Attention turned to the barred doorway. The carvings on its frame were intricate, lines of symbols that matched neither the known hieroglyphs of the region, nor any neighboring culture's script. One of the team members, fluent in several ancient languages, ran her fingers over them, and frowned. "They don't read like a text," she said quietly. They read like instructions. When she tried to translate fragments, the words came out in strange disjointed phrases. "Step not beyond the measure, count the breaths. Return before the voice answers." The meaning was unclear, but the tone was not. These were not blessings or dedications, they were rules. Beyond the bars, the darkness seemed to shift just enough for Carter to swear he had seen movement. Holden dismissed it, a trick of the lantern light, nothing more. Still the group lingered longer than necessary in that first chamber, reluctant to approach too close to the lattice. Before leaving, Holden ordered a temporary seal placed over the breach, not to keep anything in, he insisted, but to protect the chamber from damage overnight. A canvas barrier was stretched across the opening, anchored with sandbags. That night, as the wind rose again, those sleeping nearest the passage reported hearing a faint tapping, irregular, like the sound of fingers on wood. Others heard a slow, steady drip, though no water had been found inside the tomb. By morning the sand around the entrance was marked again. Not lines this time, nor symbols, but shapes. Small circular depressions arranged in a perfect ring. Each was about the size of a human breath, frozen in the sand. The first breach had been made, and with it the tomb had begun to answer. When they returned to the tomb, the next morning, the air in the passage seemed different, cooler, heavier, as though the desert outside had receded into a distant memory, replaced by something older and stiller. The canvas barrier over the breach hung limp, untouched by any draft. Holden ordered the barrier removed. As the last fold of fabric fell away, the chamber beyond greeted them in the same eerie condition as before. Jars intact, walls pristine, the barred doorway at the far end waiting with patient silence. The stone lattice was no crude barrier. It had been carved from a single slab, the vertical bars so evenly spaced that they seemed almost delicate. Yet, when Carter tapped one with his chisel, the sound that came back was deep and resonant, like striking the trunk of an ancient tree. It rang for several seconds before fading, the tone lingering in the bones more than in the ears. Holden ran his hand over the frame again, tracing the strange non-hieroglyphic symbols. Their patterns still resisted clear interpretation, but the arrangement was hypnotic. Curling arcs and angular strokes balanced so perfectly that they seemed to vibrate in the lantern light. When Holden gave the order to dismantle part of the lattice, they approached with a kind of ceremonial caution. Chisels and small hammers were used at first, but the stone proved far harder than anticipated. After several hours, they had removed only a single vertical bar, enough to allow one person to slip through sideways. It was Carter again who volunteered. He passed his lantern through first, and then squeezed after it, his boots landing softly on the floor of the chamber beyond. From the inside, his voice came back muted, as though wrapped in cotton. "Walls are covered in something," he said. "Not paint, not carvings." The rest of his words was swallowed in a strange low reverberation. Holden joined him through the narrow gap, followed by two more team members. Immediately, they noticed the difference in sound. Their footsteps made no sharp clack against the floor. Instead, each step seemed to dissolve into a soft layered echo that returned not from one direction, but from all around. The chamber was larger than the first, circular with a domed ceiling that rose so high the lantern light barely touched it. Every inch of the walls was lined with panels of smooth dark stone, unlike anything found in the surrounding geology. These panels reflected light in a subtle, oily shimmer, and when they ran their hands over them, they felt faint indentations, shallow grooves, like the ridges on a shell. When Carter spoke again, his words seemed to fragment, parts of each sentence echoing from different points in the room, delayed by half a heartbeat. It was deeply disorienting, as if the chamber were deciding which parts of speech to return and which to keep. In the center of the floor lay a circular depression about 2 meters wide, filled with fine sand far darker than the desert outside, almost black, but with flecks of silver that winked in the lantern light. The depression was perfectly symmetrical, its rim lined with the same strange script as the lattice. One of the team suggested the sand might have been brought from another site, perhaps a riverbed or volcanic region, but its composition was unlike anything they had handled before. When Carter picked up a handful, the grains clung faintly to his skin, not with moisture, but with a static-like pull. They noticed, too, that the echoing of their voices seemed stronger when they stood near the sandpit. A simple whisper here could bloom into a rolling murmur that lasted several seconds before vanishing into the high dome. Holden began to suspect the chamber had been designed as an acoustic device, a place where sound itself was the focus. Ancient cultures had built similar spaces for ceremonies, oracles, and rites, using architecture to manipulate the human voice into something otherworldly. But never had he seen an example so refined, nor so hidden away. As they moved along the walls, they found that certain spots amplified the echoes more than others. Standing in one of these hot spots, even the faintest breath could seem to multiply, returning as layered sighs from unseen corners of the room. It was while exploring one of these points that they heard something unexpected, a sound faint and rhythmic that none of them had made. It was too slow to be footsteps, too deliberate to be dripping water, a steady measured knock, 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. The team froze, the knocking continued, but its source was impossible to locate. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. They tested the idea that it might be their own movements feeding back through the echo chamber, but even when all stood perfectly still, the sound persisted. Holden made a note of it in his logbook, but chose not to comment aloud. Instead, he directed them to document the chamber's dimensions and features. It was a subtle way of keeping everyone focused on the task rather than on the creeping unease. Along the far side of the circular chamber, opposite the lattice entrance, they discovered another passageway, narrower this time, its entrance flanked by 2 tall, slender figures carved in low relief. These figures were not stylized in the usual way of ancient art. Their proportions were elongated, their faces expressionless, and their eyes left blank, as though meant to be filled in with something that had since vanished. The narrow passage beyond was blocked, not by stone, but by a heavy curtain of some dark fibrous material that crumbled slightly at the edges but still held together. The knocking stopped the moment they approached it. They debated whether to breach the curtain immediately or leave it for later study. Holden decided to wait, arguing that each stage of entry should be carefully documented before moving forward. But the truth, as he later admitted in private notes, was that something about that curtain unsettled him in a way the sealed door and barred lattice had not. As they retreated back through the lattice into the first chamber, the change in sound was immediate. The normal acoustics of enclosed stone returned, and their voices fell back into natural rhythm. Only Carter lingered in the echo chamber a moment longer, standing beside the black sand pit. He whispered something. None of the others heard what, and listened as the echo returned to him in a form that was not quite his own voice. That night, back at camp, Carter woke twice to the sensation of someone murmuring just outside his tent. When he opened the flap, the desert was empty, the wind still, but faintly, in the distance, came the slow rhythm of 3 knocks. The next morning dawned under a sky so pale, it seemed the color had been drained from it. Even the dunes outside camp were subdued, their edges softened, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Holden's orders were simple but deliberate. No large team this time, just himself, Carter, and Lean, the expedition's epigrapher, whose quiet precision and uncanny memory for symbols had already proven invaluable. 3 people, 3 lanterns, and the minimum of disturbance. They moved quickly through the entry chamber, past the barred lattice, and into the echoing dome. The black sand lay undisturbed, its faint shimmer still catching the light like embers beneath water. The room's peculiar acoustics pressed in on them again, every shuffle of their boots blooming outward and returning like ghostly company. The curtain waited where they had left it, tall, dark, and heavy. In the lantern light, its fibers glistened faintly, as though a thin film of oil coated them. The weave was irregular, but dense, the strands twisting together in a way that suggested they had once been supple, but were now stiff with age. Lean knelt first, examining the lowest edge. "It's organic," she said quietly. "Not plant fiber, not animal hair, something else." She didn't offer a guess, and Holden didn't press her. Carter ran a fingertip along one of the strands. It was cool to the touch, and strangely smooth, smoother than any woven cloth from known antiquity. When he lifted his finger away, there was no dust, no trace of decay. Holden finally gave the nod. Carter took out a small sharp knife and began cutting a vertical slit down the center. The material resisted the blade, at first, almost flexing around it, before yielding with a soft fibrous sigh. It was like parting a living thing. As the slit widened, a stale but oddly sweet smell escaped, not the rot of death, but something closer to the scent of dried flowers and old parchment. It wrapped around them in the confined passage, gentle yet clinging, as though the air beyond had been sealed so long that even its scent had become part of the architecture. Lantern light slid through the opening first, then their bodies. They stepped into a narrow corridor, the walls close enough to brush with outstretched hands. The stone here was different again, pale, almost chalk white, with a fine grain that caught the light like frost. And everywhere, scratched into the surface, were shallow marks, not writing exactly, but repeated arcs and spirals, like waves frozen mid-motion. The floor dipped slightly as they moved forward, and the air grew warmer, not the warmth of sun-heated stone, but the deep, retained warmth of a space that had held its own climate for centuries. Their footsteps made almost no sound now, as if the corridor itself absorbed their presence. About 15 meters in, they came to a small alcove carved into the right wall. Inside sat a low stone plinth, its top surface covered with tiny objects, beads, bone fragments, and a single small disc of hammered gold, no bigger than a coin. The disc bore no symbols, only a perfectly smooth surface that reflected the lantern flame in a tight, unwavering point. Halden reached for it, then hesitated. It was Lean who broke the silence. "These aren't offerings, they're markers, the kind used to note progress through a ritual space." She glanced at the walls again, running her fingertips over the wave-like carvings. "They're counting something," she murmured. "Or recording a rhythm." The corridor bent gently to the left, then opened into another chamber, smaller than the Echo Dome, but far more intricate. Here, the walls were covered in deeply incised carvings, so finely executed, they seemed to shift under the moving light. The figures were not human, but elongated beings with narrow shoulders and long trailing garments. They were shown in pairs, facing each other across what looked like great bowls or basins, from which lines radiated outward like ripples in water. The floor was made of large fitted slabs, each etched with a single symbol from the strange script. Unlike the rougher symbols on the lattice, these were crisp, their edges still sharp despite the passage of millennia. At the far end of the chamber was what could only be called a threshold, an arched frame of dark stone, its curve so perfectly smooth, it looked almost machined. The space within the arch was filled not with darkness, but with a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer, as if the air itself had a thickness to it. They approached slowly, lanterns held high. The shimmer didn't move, but it seemed to react to their proximity, deepening slightly in tone, a shift one felt more than saw. Carter, ever the first to volunteer, stepped up to the arch and extended his hand toward the center. Before his fingers could touch the shimmer, a faint vibration traveled through the stone underfoot, as though some vast mechanism far below had stirred. Halden told him to stop. They stepped back in unison, the vibration fading almost immediately. There was a long taut silence. Lean broke it with a whisper. "This isn't a burial chamber." Her voice carried a certainty that startled even her. When Halden asked what she meant, she only shook her head. They documented everything. Sketches, rubbings, photographs, then began the slow walk back through the curtain passage. On the way, they passed the alcove again. The gold disc was gone. Carter swore he hadn't taken it. Neither had Halden or Lean. They searched the floor, the walls, even the folds of their clothing, but found nothing. The plinth sat bare under the lantern light, as if it had always been that way. When they finally emerged into the echo chamber, the black sand looked subtly different. The silver flecks seemed to have shifted, forming faint patterns, curves, and lines that, from a certain angle, echoed the wave shapes carved in the passage walls. That night, none of them slept easily. The curtain they had cut seemed to hang in their minds as vividly as it had in the stone corridor, its oily fibers swaying gently in some unseen current. And more than once, each of them dreamed of reaching through it again, only to find that, on the other side, the air shimmered like water, and something tall and patient was waiting there. The following day began with a silence almost as heavy as the stone above them. No one spoke over breakfast. Even the clink of metal cups against the enamel tableware seemed muted. The three who had entered the curtain passage now carried something unspoken between them, a mixture of caution and inevitability. Holden called for a minimal crew again, but this time added 2 more. Yara, the team's photographer, and Anwar, a local historian who had guided expeditions for decades but rarely ventured far inside. Toombs himself, they would be the first in living memory to pass beyond the arched threshold. The curtain was exactly as they'd left it, the slit, neat and undisturbed. Through it, the corridor lay in the same preserved stillness, the shallow wave patterns on the walls catching the light like frozen water. The gold disc on the plinth remained absent, a small absence that weighed on them more than the heavy air. When they reached the chamber with the arch, the shimmer still hung there. It wasn't quite visible so much as it was perceptible, a distortion of space that the eye wanted to slide past. Holden ordered that no one touch it directly. Instead, he extended the tip of a long, thin copper rod through the shimmer. The air within resisted faintly, like pushing through thick oil, then gave way. The rod emerged unharmed, but a faint scent, sharp, mineral, and slightly metallic, drifted out, distinct from the floral parchment aroma of the earlier space. One by one, they stepped through. The transition was immediate. The air was warmer, but astonishingly dry, and the faint shimmer seemed to cling to their clothing for a heartbeat before letting go. Beyond was a chamber, unlike any they had seen, neither fully natural nor fully hewn. The walls curved gently upward into a high domed ceiling, but their surfaces were not stone in the familiar sense. They appeared to be layered with something that looked like compressed ash or a pale flaking plaster. Upon this surface, thousands upon thousands of tiny symbols were incised, arranged in vertical columns that ran from floor to ceiling. Linen froze, lantern raised. "This isn't decoration," she breathed. "This is writing. All of it. Every wall, each symbol was only a few centimeters tall, carved so precisely that the edges still caught light despite their probable age. The script was unlike any known ancient writing system. No pictographs, no obvious phonetic alphabet. Instead, the characters seemed to shift between angular and flowing forms, some reminiscent of constellations, others like the ripples and arcs they'd seen before. Anwar stepped forward, awe softening the lines of his face. "These are records," he said, though how he could be sure was unclear. They called this an archive. The floor here was smooth and slightly concave, as though it had been polished by centuries of movement, though no human had set foot here in 4,000 years, if the seal above was to be believed. At the very center stood a low cylindrical pedestal of dark stone, different from the pale walls. Atop it rested an object that seemed almost too modern for the setting. A perfectly spherical stone, black as obsidian, with faint veins of silver tracing across its surface. No one touched it. Instead, they circled the room slowly, Yara photographing each wall. But there was a problem. In her viewfinder, many of the carvings were faint or blurred, as if the camera refused to focus on them. Yet to the naked eye, they remained clear. Linen crouched beside one column, tracing the air just above the carvings. She wasn't touching the wall, but her movements slowed, as if she felt resistance. An invisible film stretched over the surface. "Not just records," she murmured, "preserved in more than stone." At intervals around the room, larger symbols broke the uniform grid, circular, medallion-like carvings, surrounded by radiating lines. Each medallion was different, but all shared the same subtle alignment. When you stood before one and looked across the room, it pointed directly toward the black sphere on the pedestal. Anwar noticed something else. In the upper sections of the walls, the characters became less dense, the spacing wider, as if the text was dissolving into emptiness. "It's like the record thins," he said, as if they were describing something that was fading from their world. The silence in the room was peculiar. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but the sensation that sound had no weight here, that words and noises alike would simply be absorbed into the walls. Even their breathing felt muted, their movements strangely deliberate. Holden finally allowed Carter to approach the sphere. He bent over it, examining the silver veins. "They're not random," Carter said after a moment. "They connect, like a network." Lennon stepped beside him, and realized the veins resembled the wave patterns in the corridor, but here they crossed and branched, forming something like a map. They debated whether to move it. Anwar warned against it. Lennon argued that removing it might be the only way to study it properly. In the end, Holden decided it would remain where it was, at least for now. As they turned to leave, Lennon noticed a small recess in the base of the pedestal. Inside was another disc, this one not gold, but made of a pale translucent stone that caught the light in milky swirls. Unlike the vanished gold disc, this one felt cold, almost damp when she picked it up. She slipped it into a specimen pouch, intending to analyze it later. Stepping back through the shimmer was stranger than entering. For a moment, Carter swore he heard a low rhythmic pulse, not sound exactly, but something that pressed faintly at his ribs in time with his heartbeat. Once they were back in the outer chamber, it vanished. The return walk through the curtain passage felt longer, though they knew it was the same. The black sand in the echo dome now seemed to have more silver than before, the flecks denser, their curves more deliberate. Lennon lingered, looking back at the curtain they had cut. In the shifting lamplight, the fibers seemed to have drawn inward slightly, as though beginning to close again. By the time they reached the surface, the sky was dimming toward evening. Holden ordered the site sealed for the night, guards posted at the entrance. No one spoke during dinner. The archive had left them with more questions than answers, and a quiet pressing sense that whatever they had stepped into had not simply been sleeping for 4,000 years, it had been waiting. The desert was never truly silent. Even in the deepest hours of the night, there was the whisper of sand carried by the wind, the faint rasp of grains settling against the canvas of a tent, the distant call of some unseen creature under the stars. But that night, the camp heard nothing. It was as though the world had taken a long, deliberate breath and refused to let it go. The guards at the tomb entrance later claimed the torches burned differently, the flames leaning ever so slightly toward the darkness, rather than away from it. One man swore the light seemed thinner, stretched too far without losing its brightness. They chalked it up to tired eyes and long hours, but their voices were hushed when they spoke. Holden sat at the central table in the expedition tent, reviewing Yara's photographs. The images from the curtain passage looked as expected, but those from the archive chamber troubled him. Entire columns of symbols were simply gone, in some frames replaced by strange vertical blurs, and in others by nothing but blank wall. And yet he knew he had seen those carvings himself, only hours before. Layan leaned over his shoulder. "It's not just the symbols," she said softly. "Look at the floor. In several of the images, faint marks appeared on the polished stone surface, lines in a shallow arc, as though something heavy had been dragged in a perfect curve. No one in the team recalled making them. They decided to wait until morning to re-enter. But at dawn, when Holden emerged from his tent, he saw the first undeniable change. The dunes beyond the camp had shifted overnight, not the usual gentle migration of sand under wind, but sharp, deliberate ridges that ran in unnaturally straight lines, each perfectly parallel to the next, like the grooves of a vast record. From a high vantage point, they formed a spiral pattern that pointed directly toward the tomb's entrance. Anwar stood beside him, eyes narrowed against the rising sun. "This is no work of wind," he said quietly. "It's as though the sand was instructed." In the camp, Carter examined the specimen pouch containing the translucent disc from the pedestal. Its milky swirls seemed denser now, as if clouds had gathered within it overnight. When he held it up to the light, faint shapes shimmered in its depths, curves and arcs eerily similar to those carved into the corridor walls. He thought he heard a distant sound when he stared too long, the same low pulse he'd felt when leaving the archive. The first true omen appeared shortly after breakfast. A shout went up from the western edge of camp. When Holden and Leon arrived, they found a small dune split neatly in two, as though sliced by a blade. In the exposed core of the sand was something black, not stone, not wood, but a smooth glassy material that caught the sun and reflected it in narrow beams. It was shaped like a disc, though far larger than the ones they had found inside the tomb, perhaps a meter across, and it was warm. Anwar insisted they rebury it. "This belongs to the same people who built that archive," he said, voice tight. It was meant to remain hidden, but Halden, stubborn as ever, ordered Carter to document it fully before covering it again. The material was harder than obsidian, with no visible seams or imperfections. A single shallow groove ran across its surface, too precise to be the work of chance erosion. By midday, the spiral ridges in the distance had lengthened. The pattern was no longer subtle. It could be seen clearly from the camp, its curling arm reaching ever closer. The air had grown warmer too, not with the natural heat of the desert sun, but with a dry, almost electric edge, like the moments before a summer storm. That night, Yara could not sleep. She sat outside her tent, staring at the spiral under the moonlight. It glowed faintly, not brightly, not enough to illuminate the sand around it, but enough that she could see it even when she closed her eyes. The pattern lingered in her vision, pulsing gently in time with her heartbeat. Leon woke with the same vision. So did Carter. By morning, they realized each of them had dreamed of walking along that spiral, the sand firm beneath their feet, the air filled with a soundless vibration. In the dream, the spiral did not lead to the tomb. It led somewhere beyond the dunes, to a place none of them had yet seen. When they re-entered the tomb to check the archive chamber, they found new changes. The walls had shifted subtly. Columns of symbols that had been in one place now appeared in another, as though the text were rewriting itself. The silver veins on the black sphere had lengthened, branching outward in new directions. The sphere now emitted a faint warmth, just enough to feel when standing close. Carter thought he detected a pattern in the heat, a rhythmic variation, almost like breathing. Leon argued it was his imagination, but even she could not deny the change in the shimmer that marked the threshold into the archive. It was thicker now, and crossing it left a faint tingling along the skin, as if tiny currents of air moved against the grain of motion. On their way out, Leon paused at the echo dome. The black sand was different again. The silver flecks now formed distinct lines, all converging toward the slit in the curtain they had cut days before. When she whispered into the dome, the echo returned, not as her voice but as something deeper, slower, a voice like stone sliding against stone, speaking words she could not understand. By the time they emerged into the daylight, the spiral in the dunes had grown again, and now, at its outermost edge, something broke the smooth surface, a series of evenly spaced black shapes, each just visible above the sand, standing like silent sentinels. Anwar refused to approach them. "They are markers," he said flatly. "They mean we are inside something's boundary now." Halden stared at the horizon for a long moment, then ordered preparations for an expedition toward the spiral's center at first light. Whatever was happening, it was spreading. And if it had begun with the opening of the tomb, it might not end there. Morning came with a thin veil of mist that did not belong to the desert. It lay low over the dunes, blurring the spiral's edges, making the ridges look like waves caught in the act of curling. For a moment, Halden thought the spiral had stopped growing, but when the sun cleared the horizon, he saw that it had not stopped at all. It had doubled in size overnight. The black shapes at the spiral's edge were now clearly visible, tall, narrow slabs of the same glassy material as the buried disk from the day before. They stood at precise intervals, each perfectly vertical despite the shifting sand around them. Their surfaces reflected the sky in distorted, wavering patterns, as though the glass was not solid at all, but liquid caught in stillness. The team gathered at the central tent to discuss the day's plan. Yara spread her photographs across the table, not only from the archive chamber, but from every corridor wall panel and carving they had documented since entering the tomb. She arranged them in an order that at first glance seemed random, but as more pieces joined the mosaic, a pattern began to emerge. The corridor markings, the sphere's silver veins, the faint grooves on the black discs, even the ridges of the spiral outside, all shared the same arcs and intersections. They were not identical, but variations on a theme, like different verses of the same song. Lewin frowned. "You're saying the entire tomb is a map?" "Not a map," Yara said. "Not in the way we think of maps. It doesn't show places, it shows relationships, movement, a kind of geometry that changes." She pointed to a photograph of the black sphere taken on their first day in the archive. The silver veins in that image were shorter, less branched. She placed it beside an image from the day before. The veins had lengthened. When she traced the curves with a finger, they aligned with the spiral in the dunes down to the smallest deviation. "The sphere is showing what's happening outside," Carter murmured, "and maybe predicting what comes next." Haldon leaned back, rubbing his temples. "If it's changing in response to what's happening out there, then the tomb isn't just storing this information, it's part of it." Connected, Anwar shifted uncomfortably. "This is what I feared. The tomb is not simply a place of the dead, it is a device, it is doing something." The question was, what? By late morning, they stood at the edge of the spiral. The black slabs rose above them like silent towers, their glassy faces warping the world into shimmering curves. When Haldon approached one, the air grew noticeably cooler, and a faint vibration hummed at the edge of hearing. He reached out a hand, but Anwar caught his wrist. "You touch this, and you may not come back the same," he said. Instead, they circled the spiral's outer rim, noting the position of each slab. Lewin sketched furiously, comparing her notes to the photographs from inside the tomb. After half an hour, she stopped abruptly, staring at her notebook. "It's the same," she whispered. "The slabs are positioned exactly like the pillars in the second chamber, and the grooves on those pillars match the lines in the corridor etchings." Yara glanced toward the tomb entrance in the distance, which means the tomb's interior is a miniature version of what's happening out here. The realization settled over them, like the stillness before a storm. The map wasn't meant to be studied from above, it was meant to be walked, experienced. Every corridor, every turn in the tomb, was a step along the same geometry now written in sand outside. Carter suggested testing the idea. They returned to the archive chamber, and placed a camera before the sphere, set to record a time-lapse. If the silver veins continued to grow in sync with the spiral outside, they would have proof. In the process, they noticed something else. The faint groove on the pedestal, where the translucent disc had sat, was no longer empty. A thin film of the same black glassy substance as the slabs was forming in the depression, creeping outward at an almost imperceptible rate. It shimmered faintly, as though holding an image just beneath its surface. When Yara leaned closer, she swore she saw movement within it, not random swirls, but shapes drifting like constellations across a night sky. They reminded her of the spiral dunes but inverted, as if she were looking down from above. By evening, the mist had returned, thicker this time. It clung to the camp, muffling sound, making the generator's hum seem distant. The spiral was barely visible through the haze, yet the black slabs seemed sharper, their edges cutting clean through the air. That night, no one slept. Some stayed awake from unease, others because the geometry of the spiral kept intruding into their minds, refusing to let go. Haldon lay on his cot, tracing the pattern in his mind's eye, following its curves over and over, until he realized something. The spiral was not expanding randomly. It was growing toward a fixed point on the horizon, a place far beyond the dunes. If you overlaid the spiral's path on a larger map, it did not center on the tomb. It pointed somewhere else entirely. In the early hours, Haldon gathered the team. They spread out all the photographs again, along with Lewin's sketches and the GPS readings from the spiral's edge. Working in silence, they overlaid the tomb's interior design, the archive's carvings, and the dune's current formation. The result was chilling. Every layer matched, and all of them pointed toward a single coordinate deep in the desert. Not a mountain, not a known ruin, Not even a marked geological feature, just empty sand. Carter broke the silence. If this is a map, then that's where it ends. Anwar's expression was grave. Or where it begins. The choice before them was clear. Follow the geometry into the unknown, or turn back now and leave the mystery unsolved. But as Haldon looked at the shifting silver veins on the sphere, at the slabs outside, cutting through the mist, at the spiral curling ever closer to its hidden destination, he knew they had already crossed a threshold from which there was no true return. The tomb was not a vault, and the archive was not a record. They were parts of something larger, a design written across stone and sand, patient and precise, waiting for someone to read it. The morning sun rose into a pale, bleached sky, but its light did not burn away the mist. Instead, the haze clung stubbornly to the dunes, as though drawn by some hidden tether to the spiral. It gave the desert a strange duality, sky and ground both blurred, yet the black slabs stood out in perfect razor clarity. Haldon had the team ready before dawn. No excavation today, no cataloging artifacts, just one purpose: follow the geometry to where it wanted to lead. They packed light, water, rations, portable instruments, and a satellite beacon that Carter insisted on carrying, despite the fact that in the last 24 hours, their GPS signals had begun to drift inexplicably. Before setting out, Yara returned to the archive chamber for one last look. The sphere's silver veins had spread even farther overnight, curling in on themselves like new shoots. And at the very center of the pattern, for the first time, a gap appeared, a void in the otherwise intricate web. It was shaped almost exactly like the coordinates they had plotted the night before. When she rejoined the others outside, the spiral's outer rim felt different beneath her boots. The sand was denser here, compacted into faint ridges that resisted the wind. As they moved inward, the intervals between the slabs decreased, as though drawing them into a funnel. Half an hour into their trek, Anwar stopped abruptly. He had been walking with a staff, tapping it into the sand with each step, and now it struck something solid. He crouched, brushing the surface with gloved fingers. A smooth plane emerged, the same glassy black substance as the slabs, but horizontal, buried just beneath the dunes. Lian ran her palm along it, feeling the faintest hum, like a current passing under the skin. "This isn't a marker," she said quietly. "It's part of the same structure. The slabs, they're just the visible tips." The further they went, the more of these hidden plates appeared, connected in long arcs beneath the sand. It was as if they were walking over the ribs of some colossal buried form. The mist thickened toward the spiral's center, shapes lost their sharpness, distances became uncertain. Sometimes a slab appeared to be several meters away, only to loom suddenly close when approached. Sound behaved strangely, too. Their voices seemed to carry both farther and shorter than expected, as if the air itself was bending around them. At one point, Carter called for a stop. His compass needle was no longer pointing north. Instead, it twitched between directions, sometimes holding steady on a point that matched the spiral's inward curve. He tapped the face of the instrument in frustration, but the behavior continued. "This is what I meant," Anwar said, his voice low. "The boundary is not just physical, it's environmental. We've crossed into something that doesn't follow the same rules." They pressed on. The sand beneath their feet grew cooler, despite the climbing sun, finer too, as if each grain had been ground smooth by centuries of something other than wind. The glassy plates beneath appeared more frequently now, almost forming a continuous floor. Each time Yara's boot struck one, the vibration traveled up through her bones in a way that made her teeth ache. 2 hours in, they reached what seemed to be the spiral's heart. Here, the slabs formed a tight circle, each leaning subtly inward, as though bowing toward the center. The ground within was not sand at all, but a solid disk of the black glassy material, perfectly smooth, perfectly level. It was cold to the touch, colder than the air, colder than any stone had a right to be under the desert sun. At the disk's center lay a depression about a meter wide, and within it nothing. No dust, no debris, just emptiness, so pure it almost looked like a hole in reality. When Yara knelt beside it, she saw no depth, only darkness that seemed to resist her gaze. "This is it," Halden said. "The coordinate. The end of the pattern, or the start," Anwar murmured, echoing his own words from the night before. The moment stretched, wind sighed faintly at the circle's edge, but within the ring of slabs, the air was utterly still. Even the mist outside the boundary stopped short, as if reluctant to cross. Carter, restless, dropped a small stone into the depression. It made no sound when it vanished into the black. No clink, no thud, only absence. Yara's breath quickened. "It's not a hole," it's before she could finish. The slab nearest her emitted a low, resonant tone. The others followed, one by one, until the entire ring was vibrating in harmony. The sound was deep enough to feel in the chest, more physical than audible. Beneath their feet, the glassy disc thrummed like the surface of a drum. The vibration didn't fade, it built, and as it did, the smooth floor beneath them began to ripple. Not breaking, not cracking, rippling, as though it were liquid in disguise. Leon stumbled back toward the edge, but Halden stood frozen, watching the depression. The darkness within was no longer featureless. Faint patterns were forming, identical to those in the sphere's silver veins. Only now, they were moving, coiling inward toward a point beyond sight. Anwar's voice was barely audible over the deep resonance. "This is the boundary. The place where stone stops being stone." The ripples spread outward, reaching the ring of slabs. The mist outside began to glow faintly, though no source of light was visible. Their equipment screens flickered, displaying static overlaid with brief flashes of geometric shapes. Then abruptly, the tone ceased. The ripples stilled, the darkness in the depression returned to featureless black. It was as if nothing had happened, except for one detail. The GPS beacon Carter carried now displayed a set of coordinates they had never entered, ones that shifted slowly, as if pointing not to a fixed location, but to something in motion. No one spoke for a long time. The air felt heavier, the silence denser. It was clear that whatever they had just witnessed was not a random phenomenon. The tomb, the spiral, the slabs, all were part of a mechanism whose operation they had only glimpsed. Halden finally broke the stillness. "We follow it." No one argued. The sense of choice had vanished. Crossing the spiral's heart had been like stepping over an invisible threshold. Behind them lay the familiar desert. Before them stretched a landscape they now knew was anything but empty. They packed their gear in silence, and began walking toward the direction indicated by the shifting coordinates. With every step away from the black disk, the mist began to thicken again, but this time, it felt less like weather and more like a veil being drawn between worlds. It wasn't the absence of sound that comes with early morning, nor the muffled quiet of a snowfall. It was the kind that settles over a place that should be alive with noise, but isn't, as though something had pressed its finger to the world's lips. The spiral fell away behind them, its outermost slabs fading into the mist, until they became mere suggestions of shape. Yet the sense of it lingered like a low note that continues to hum long after it's been played. Each of them felt it differently. Yara, as a faint pull in her chest. Halden, as a pressure at the base of his skull. Anwar, as a whisper at the edge of thought. The desert ahead looked ordinary at first glance, pale dunes rolling away under a sun still weak with morning. But as they walked, those dunes seemed to shift in ways that made Carter mutter curses under his breath. They would set a landmark, a jagged ridge, a cluster of darker sand, only to find it vanish or reappear at impossible angles. "Mirage effect," Leon said at first, trying to reassure herself, but the logic frayed quickly. The changes didn't match the heat shimmer of a typical mirage. These were structural, solid, a dune crest simply gone, replaced by a hollow, as though it had never been there. The coordinates on Carter's beacon moved slowly ahead of them, but in a way that was maddeningly inconsistent. Sometimes they advanced several meters in the space of a few seconds. Other times, they hung stubbornly still, forcing the group to recheck their orientation. After the first hour, the sunlight began to take on a strange quality. It felt thinner, as though filtered through something not quite visible. Shadows grew longer than they should have, stretching toward the direction they were heading. At times Yara thought she saw movement in those shadows, the faint curl of a form before it smoothed back into nothingness. They stopped to drink water, and that was when Anwar spotted the first of them. Half buried in the sand was a shard of something pale and curved. At first glance, it looked like bone, worn smooth by centuries. But when he brushed it clean, faint lines became visible, not cracks, but deliberate carvings. The marks were shallow, precise, forming a lattice that seemed too delicate to belong to any weapon or tool. It reminded Yara of the sphere's veins, but without the silver gleam. When Leon passed a scanner over it, the display flickered, then shut off entirely. The shard was cold to the touch. They left it in place, not from fear exactly, but from the growing sense that whatever they disturbed here might not appreciate being taken. The land began to change subtly. The dunes became lower, the sand finer, almost like dust. More of the glassy black plates emerged here, lying in irregular lines that sometimes disappeared under the dust and reappeared several meters later. Some were cracked, revealing a faint shimmer deep inside, like light caught in ice. At midday, they paused to eat. The sun, directly overhead, should have been blinding, yet the sky retained a muted quality, as though they were under a vast sheet of frosted glass. The air was cool enough that no one sweated despite the walking. That was when the first sound returned. It came from the horizon, a slow deep rhythm that might have been wind, except there was no movement in the air. It was too regular to be natural, and too far away to identify. Halden said nothing, but the set of his jaw told the others he had decided it was important. They adjusted their heading to match both the sound and the shifting coordinates. 2 hours later, they crested a shallow rise and saw it, or rather saw them. In the distance stood a scattering of upright shapes, unevenly spaced, half swallowed by the dust. At first they seemed like more slabs, but as the group drew nearer, details emerged. These were taller, narrower, and marked from top to bottom with the same lattice pattern as the bone-like shard. Some had toppled, and now lay cracked in pieces, their interiors hollow, yet lined with a smooth mirror-like surface. The rhythm grew louder here, resonating faintly through the ground. Carter swore under his breath, and muttered something about subsurface machinery, but even he didn't sound convinced. Yara ran her fingers over one of the upright structures. It was cool like the black plates, but felt almost organic under the gloves, too subtly irregular for pure stone. When she pressed her ear against it, the deep rhythm became clearer, layered with faint harmonics, as if hundreds of smaller beats accompanied the main one. Leon, meanwhile, was scanning the horizon. "There's more," she said. Her voice was hushed, though she wasn't sure why. And indeed, beyond the upright shapes, the land dropped away into a shallow basin, where dozens more stood in concentric arcs, like frozen sentinels. The coordinates shifted again, this time pulling them toward the basin's center. The descent was unnerving. The rhythm from below grew more complex, and the air itself seemed to thicken. The dust no longer clung to their boots, it slid away, revealing more of the black plates beneath. Some were engraved with the spiral's curves, but here they were incomplete, as though mid-carving when the work had stopped. At the basin's lowest point, the ground formed another disc, smaller than the one in the spiral's heart, but surrounded by 4 of the lattice-marked monoliths. The disc pulsed faintly, not with light, but with a subtle contraction and release, like the surface of something breathing. Yara felt a prickle at the back of her neck. It wasn't fear exactly, but the raw awareness that they were being acknowledged. The others seemed to feel it too. The way they moved, the way they spoke in lower tones, all spoke to an unspoken agreement. This was no ruin, no abandoned place. Halden looked at the beacon, then at the disc. The coordinates had stopped moving. They had reached whatever it was pointing to. For a moment, no one approached, The rhythm from the ground was steady now, almost hypnotic, and it seemed to synchronize with their own heartbeats. The mist above the basin swirled slowly, even without wind, tracing patterns that mirrored the spiral's curves. Anwar finally broke the stillness, stepping forward until he stood just at the edge of the pulsing disk. When his boot touched it, the surface firmed instantly, as though deciding to support his weight. He glanced back at the others, then crouched, placing one palm flat. His eyes widened. "It's warm." Yara joined him, kneeling to press her own hand beside his. The warmth was subtle but steady, and beneath it was a faint, deliberate vibration, not random, but patterned like coded speech. They exchanged a look, neither willing to say aloud what they were both thinking. They had crossed the veil, and whatever lay ahead was no longer about finding a tomb. It was about finding whatever the tomb had been guarding. There was no flash of light, no cinematic jolt, only the immediate certainty that she was no longer standing in the basin. It was as if the world had folded inward, erasing the desert, the sky, even the air, replacing them with a weightless expanse. The others were still there, in some sense, but distant, like echoes of themselves. Sound returned first, but not in any form she could name. It was not music, not speech, yet it carried meaning. It moved in spirals, each loop sliding past the next, creating harmonies that seemed to sink directly into her bones. The whiteness around her rippled, resolving into a texture like hammered metal, then into shapes, vast columns, tilted and shattered, stretching into a horizon without a sun. The scale was impossible to judge. Each column could have been the height of a tree, or the length of a continent. A shadow moved across them. It wasn't a creature in the way she understood life. It had no fixed outline, shifting between forms that suggested wings, then sails, then something like a flowing river of glass. It paused, and she knew without words that it had seen her. And then came the flood. It began with the sensation of heat, blistering and raw, followed by a deep pressure, like the crushing weight of water miles beneath the ocean. The columns crumbled in reverse, stone lifting from the dust and reassembling into towers. Figures, slender, long-limbed, faceless, moved between them, carrying slabs, inscribed with the spirals she now knew too well. There was no dialogue, but she understood. This was a record. The tomb had not been built for a person, nor for a treasure. It had been built to contain something, to seal it away from the world. Her perception shifted again. She was no longer among columns, but in a canyon cut into glassy stone. The faceless figures labored to push a sphere, not unlike the one from the spiral's heart, but immense, the size of a house, into a hollow chamber. The spirals carved into its surface pulsed faintly, resisting. A sudden darkness swept over the scene, and with it, a presence. It was vast, so vast that her mind instinctively refused to give it a shape. Her chest ached from the weight of it, and for a moment, she could not breathe. The figures froze, then redoubled their work, sealing the sphere with plates, then slabs, then an entire wall of stone. The sound, that deep rhythmic pulse she had been hearing since entering the basin, was there too. It was coming from inside the sphere. The vision shifted again, this time moving forward through ages. The desert rolled over the canyon, wind erasing the last traces of its makers. The plates cracked, the slabs shifted, yet the pulse remained steady as a heartbeat. Occasionally, shadows passed over the buried site, human shadows, small and uncomprehending, who turned away before venturing too close. The rhythm changed subtly, pulling her attention back to the present. The faceless figures were gone. The canyon was gone. She stood once more in the basin, her palms still pressed to the warm disk, and she realized she was not alone in her mind. The presence was still there, smaller now, or perhaps compressed to fit within her understanding. It did not speak, but it regarded her, weighing, measuring. Her thoughts felt porous, as if it could drift through them, examining memories with a casual slowness. She sensed a question, not in words, but in the shape of the silence that followed. It was not asking who she was, It was asking why she had come. Behind her, she could feel Anwar and Holden still in contact with the disk, each lost in their own exchange. Leon and Carter stood at the edge of the circle, watching but unwilling, or perhaps unable to join. She tried to answer, without speaking. In her mind she summoned the days of digging, the nights under the stars, the long march across shifting dunes. She let it see the moment she first touched the silver sphere, the jolt of awe and dread. The presence absorbed it in silence. Then, like the release of a held breath, it showed her one final image. Not the tomb, not the canyon. A doorway. It was narrow and tall, carved from the same black material as the plates, but untouched by sand. Beyond it lay only darkness, not empty, but filled with something she could not name. The pulse grew stronger, until it was the only thing she could feel. Then it was gone. Yara staggered back from the disk, breaking contact. The air rushed in, warm and real, carrying the faint smell of dust. The basin's muted light seemed suddenly too bright. Anwar was already on his knees, breathing hard, his eyes unfocused. Holden straightened slowly, his expression unreadable, though the tightness in his jaw spoke volumes. No one spoke for a long while. They simply stood, letting their own heartbeats return to normal, trying to hold on to what they had just seen before it slipped away. Finally, Holden broke the silence. It showed me where to go. Anwar's voice was hoarse. Me too. Yara didn't reply. She didn't have to. They all knew that whatever lay beyond the doorway, the one in each of their visions was the same. The coordinates on Carter's beacon flickered, then shifted again, this time pointing toward the far side of the basin. The pulse beneath their feet had grown weaker, as though the disk had given them what it could, and was now retreating into its long vigil. As they prepared to move, Yara glanced back once more at the circle. For just an instant, she thought she saw a ripple move across its surface, like the faintest acknowledgement. Then it stilled, and the desert reclaimed the silence. The far side of the basin was nothing like the rest. The dunes here were broken, scattered, as though something had once risen from beneath them, shoving the sand aside. Shadows pooled in the low places, even though the sky overhead remained pale, and even the beacon's coordinates ended here, at what appeared to be a shallow slope of stone emerging from the earth. It looked at first like the ridge of a buried hill, until they drew closer and saw the seams. The surface was black like obsidian, but warmer, etched with the spirals they had come to know. Most were shallow, worn smooth by time, but at the center was one so crisp it could have been cut yesterday. It was the same spiral from the disk, but here it stretched nearly 10 feet across. As they traced its edge, the sand beneath their boots shifted. A slow tremor rolled outward, and the spiral's center began to sink. They stepped back instinctively as the black stone folded inward, the segments turning like the petals of a flower, until a dark mouth yawned open before them. A breath of air rose from the opening, dry, heavy, tinged with a faint metallic scent. There was no sound from below, only the endless hush of the basin. One by one, they descended. The passage was narrow at first, forcing them to move in single file, their lights grazing walls that seemed to swallow the glow, rather than reflect it. The spirals were everywhere, small ones tucked into corners, vast ones that curved out of sight. Some pulsed faintly as they passed, their rhythm matching the one that had haunted them since they arrived. The air grew warmer, denser, time lost meaning. The slope eased, and the walls fell away to reveal a chamber so vast their lights couldn't touch the far side. It was empty, almost. At the center lay a sphere, just like the one from the disk's heart, only this was immense, easily 20 feet in diameter. Its surface was seamless, except for a single hairline crack running from top to bottom. The pulse came from within, steady and alive. They approached in silence, each footstep swallowed by the vastness. No one needed to say it. This was what the tomb had guarded. Ainwar's hand hovered above the surface, trembling. Holden's eyes were fixed on the crack, as though afraid it might widen. Yara circled slowly, trying to take in the scale, the perfection of it. There were no inscriptions here, no records, no names, only the spirals, arranged in a pattern that seemed random, until she stepped back far enough to see it. A map. Not of any land she knew, not even of Earth perhaps, but a web of points connected by lines, curving in on themselves like a constellation caught in motion. She felt the presence again, faint but certain. It wasn't inside her this time, it was here, in the room, in the sphere, and she understood. The tomb was not a place of rest, it was a prison, not for a creature exactly, nor for an object in the ordinary sense, but for something that blurred the two, a seed of thought, perhaps, or a fragment of a will that had once moved through the world with terrible purpose. The people, or beings, who built this place, had not entombed it to honor it, they had entombed it to contain it. 4,000 years ago, they had locked it here, sealed the spiral, and left the basin as a warning for any who might come close. She thought of the visions, the faceless figures, the towering columns, the doorway into darkness. The message had not been an invitation, it had been a test. The crack in the sphere pulsed faintly now, as though aware of their presence. She could feel it probing the edges of her thoughts again, softer this time, almost patient. Holden whispered, "If they went to this much trouble to keep it here, maybe we should leave it." No one argued. They stood there for a long while, listening to the rhythm, committing every detail to memory. Then, without ceremony, they turned back toward the passage. The ascent felt shorter. When they emerged into the basin, the spiral at the entrance folded closed behind them, seamless once more. The tremor faded, and the desert returned to its stillness. The coordinates on Carter's beacon went dark. The pulse beneath their feet vanished. By the time they reached the edge of the basin, the wind had begun to move again, carrying with it the soft hiss of shifting sand. When they looked back, the slope of stone was already disappearing beneath the dunes. They did not speak of what they had seen, not that day, not the next. Some things they knew could only survive in silence. And far below, in the dark chamber, the sphere pulsed on steady as a heartbeat, waiting for the next time the world forgot why it had been guarded.